Start recording. All right, so we are very happy to have Abhishek Kumar from uh, CSEP, and he will tell me what the full form is. Uh, Talk about productivity growth on domestic savings across countries. All right. Okay, so Abhishek, whenever you're ready. Uh,
Yeah, I'm ready.
if
Yeah.
just quickly, if you want to interrupt at any point in time, you can, but please keep questions to clarificatory nature, and we have 10 minutes after to talk for um, more detailed questions. All right, Abhishek, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. And once again, thank you for having me. The CSEP is basically Center for Social and Economic Progress, formerly Brookings, India. The work that I'm going to present is a part of UNU wider project on domestic financing. And it's a joint work with Professor Susanta Malik and Professor Kunal Sen. And usual disclaimer, the work that I'm going to present it basically represent the personal opinion of the author, and it doesn't in any way reflect the views of the organizations they work for. So yeah, I will start with a very brief introduction, in a sense that ultimately this work is going to try to solve the uh, uh, like to some extent to solve the problem that we have seen in literature, that what determines saving, and especially what determines the cross country variation in saving. And at the end of this walk and at the end of this presentation, I will try to make a causal claim, and it's up to you people to see, judge how much I succeed in doing that. Okay, so the motivation for this is very simple. Uh, if you look at a country called Cameroon in Africa, Cameroon was one of the most prosperous country in Africa during 1960, 1970, and 1980. It was growing at a very fast rate. And then suddenly something happened in 1980 when within a span of 7 to 8 years, the productivity in Cameroon declined. This is like a TFP index in the Cameroon. So that declined from around 150 to 60. So almost a 50% decline in the productivity in the Cameroon. This all happened within a span of 7 to 8 years. During the same time period, the saving in the Cameroon declined from around 25% of the GDP to around 10% of the GDP. And obviously, it's like very difficult to from here to make any claim actually that whether the saving decline led to a decline in productivity or a productivity decline led to a decline in saving. This is just one example to show that these kind of core movements happens in data, and what the objective we have in this paper is to uh, try to see the direction of causation from whether it is from saving to productivity or productivity to saving. So that's like kind of the main aim of this paper is, and then we have certain like kind of offshoots that will be discussed while the presentation. So
Quick question.
yeah.
I mean, was such a dip, as you indicated, in the gray area, observed in any of the neighboring countries or anything like that?
Neighboring countries, you mean okay, no, you mean neighboring countries of Cameroon?
Yeah.
Not this is one like certainly an outlier in Africa during that time period, and this
Okay.
happened because of the peculiar characteristic that the Cameroon had. It was majorly a commodity exporter, and the prices of the commodity like kind of fell a lot during that time period. And also there were some other issues about economic mismanagement in Cameron that has been reported and researched actually in earlier literature.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I will also, for motivation, I will tell you what we see in data in terms of TFP growth and saving rate across countries. So on an average, TFP growth in non-high income countries are lower, but the standard deviation of TFP growth in non-high income countries are higher. And as you can see, both these like kind of information or observation points to opposite response of saving. One can argue that lower TFP growth in non-high income countries should be leading to lower saving rate, but at the same time, non-high income countries have more volatile productivity, and that should lead to a kind of higher saving through various channels such as precautionary saving and other things which have been kind of like explored in literature. So ex ante also we have not a very clear understanding that how this cross country heterogeneity in TFP basically plays out for saving. And so there is a like a case to explore it further. And also the important thing is to understand that there is a cross country heterogeneity that one has to take into account while doing any cross country work. So so what this paper is going to do now is to basically tackle one of the important challenges facing developing economies. The challenge is about resource mobilization. Basically, if you think in terms of what the idea of Lewis was to like think of growth and like achieve like a higher income. Basically in the idea of Lewis, it all depends upon how an economy translates from a low saving economy to a high saving economy. So that's like a kind of a very old idea in the development literature, that understanding development is all about understanding how a country which is saving at low rate starts saving at a high rate. And that challenge still remains for a whole lot of countries in our world. So this paper is going to argue that government should think about focusing on enhancing productivity growth rather than making big bang announcement to enhance saving rate. That's like the claim that I'm going to make. We depart from the earlier literature, which has mostly focused on growth saving relationship because of three reasons. We work with productivity growth, and there are reasons for doing that. First is that productivity growth is like shock to income, which we can better map to theory based on neoclassical growth theory and permanent income hypothesis, which I'm going to do. Also, we control for potential determinants of GDP growth. So that should not be an issue. So whatever saving can be generated through GDP growth, we control for factors that can influence that. Most importantly, thinking in terms of productivity growth allows us to give like a very precise, in a sense, policy implication, which is missing when you talk about growth and saving. Because when I talk about productivity growth, basically now I also know, based on the work of Hazen Klinov and others, that there are ways to enhance productivity growth. So if I know that productivity growth can influence saving for better in the short and medium run, and I also know that how to kind of improve productivity growth, then basically I know how to increase saving rate in short and medium run. At the end of the paper, I'm also going to make a direct test of permanent income hypothesis of Milton Friedman, which to the best of our knowledge has not been done using cross-country data. And I'm going to use 47 economies with at least 40 years of continuous time series data. So
Abhishek,
how,
I just had a question. So, the kind of productivity enhancements you're thinking about are those that are just about misallocations, right? Because you could make an argument that productivity growth would require investments in technology, and investments in technology would require, the money to have invest, and this investment would be is generally funded through savings. So then it may not be possible to have productivity growth unless there is savings growth in the economy. So in that scheme of things, while productivity is important, but the savings is the vehicle that allows productivity growth to happen. So it seems that the example that you are pointing out is a very particular kind of productivity growth, which is, which existing resources exist, and then you just, there's some misallocation, and you can kind of, correct that misallocation and have productivity growth. But if you think about all the literature of Grossman and all these people with R&D spending and stuff, these all require, investments by firms, by the economy, which is largely funded through savings, no?
yes, I agree. So in few minutes, I'm going to kind of rule out the fact, or I will try to rule out the fact that the increase in saving cannot sustain like increase in productivity growth. So basically, when I make this claim about misallocation as an example, I mean to say that you can only sustain higher saving rate by increasing productivity growth and not the other way around. And if that is the point, then you should think about enhancing productivity growth. I understand your point, and I'm going to rule out in few slides that the causation works really well from growth, productivity growth to saving, and not the other way around. And I will show you why several examples actually. And that is like and I will also at the end I will show you an instrument variable regression to like substantiate my claim. So this is just an example that I'm giving about misallocation. My point is very simple, that I will rule out the fact that increase in saving can like sustain productivity growth. I will rule out that, and I will show you that productivity growth can sustain higher saving. And then the second question that arises, which is not part of this paper, but the second question is about, okay, fine, we understand that productivity growth can give us higher saving in the medium run. Now think about how we can enhance productivity growth. But I fully understand your point, and in few slides I will rule out that the causation is not the way like a lot of people have been thinking about.
Sure, thank
Okay,
you.
okay, thank you. So this work is related to like a large amount of literature that is on growth and saving, like the kind of one of the prominent literature was based on this foreign aid, and the important contribution in that literature came from Burnside and Dollar and Easterly. Basically, they try to argue very kind of logically in the way that if it was saving to growth causation, that higher saving lead to growth, then this foreign aid should have worked. But Easterly, with extensive work, found that foreign aid didn't work. But they didn't go into much detail of exploring this causation. Their argument was very simple, that if it is like saving which causes growth, then when the foreign aid comes to a country, the saving is augmented and that should bring growth. But the foreign aid didn't bring growth in any of these countries for sustained period of time. Another literature is about determination of cross-country variation in saving rate. This is more like kind of work which has not made any causal claims, but just looked at what determines the cross-country variation in saving rate. The third aspect that I'm going to talk a lot is about theoretical issues linking productivity, habit persistence in consumption, and saving ratio. So what neoclassical growth theory basically tells you about the saving rate and productivity relationship. And this part of the literature is also not very well kind of, you can say, explored. There exists like exemplary work by Carroll, but the later literature has not like been around this issue a lot. And then I'm going to also like kind of briefly touch one of the very famous literature that is coming from Agwar and Gopinath 2007, where they make claims about dominance of trained productivity in emerging economies, particularly Latin American economies, and they argue that this leads to a lot of kind of problems which are not happening in advanced economies, because in those economies the trend shock is like kind of not that volatile. So I will make the distinction between trend and cyclical productivity as I move down to theory, and that will make this point more clear. And finally, this paper is related to a new literature that has come up from Masters 2020, where they try to generate model-based instruments to do some instrument variable identification. So having said that, how I'm going to talk about TFP, because this paper is about TFP. I'm going to first estimate TFP in data. And while I estimate TFP in data, this is like a pretty standard like a step that I will do. I will do level accounting, and I will follow like Hall and Jones, and I will basically start with a simple kind of neoclassical production function, and then I will convert that production function into a per capita production function. There is a human capital kind of around here, and then I will basically estimate this human capital using years of schooling. And once I have the human capital and per capita physical capital, I will simply back out this 80, which is one measure of TFP that I will use. The relation between human capital and years of schooling is like directly borrowed from Hall and Jones 1999. So this is one measure of TFP that I will have. Another measure of TFP that I will use is based on Clinav Rodriguez. This measure is like very similar to the measure that we saw before, but this is not in terms of per capita capital, but this is in terms of capital output ratio. And again, I know capital output ratio in the data. I know H, as I explained to you before, that how I will calculate this human capital. Once I know these two things, I can again back out this 80, which is another measure of a TFP that I'm going to use. So in this paper, we do several robustness exercises for productivity growth. We take different measures of human capital.
Yeah, Abhishek, I have a question here, Moni here. So what market structure you have assumed here? If I can remember correctly, the paper that you are talking about, this Plano paper, they have assumed heterogeneity and monopolistic competition, if I can remember correctly. So what's your market structure here? Like what?
No, I'm just following their simple idea that I don't go into their market structure detail. I have simply borrowed their way of calculating TFP. So if they have some detailed market structure, I'm sorry, I'm not like kind of familiar with that. But I have simply borrowed their idea of calculation of TFP, which is like an alternative ways that many people have been using in the literature. So my connection to their paper is like this point only, to get an alternative measure of TFP.
Okay.
Yeah. So then I use different measure of human capital using Baroli data and UNESCO data. Baroli data is for 15 plus years of schooling, like age 15 plus. UNESCO gives you 25 plus. So these are two different measures of human capital I use. I do correct for female labor force participation, because female education has increased all over the world, but their labor force participation has declined. So basically average year of schooling that you see in the data might not be true reflection of the average year of schooling for the labor force. So I correct for female labor force participation, and I also like calculate both Harrod and Hicks neutral productivity. So basically, I have 12 measures of productivity in the paper. I'm going to focus on only one measure of productivity, and that is because all other measures of productivity gives like a very similar results. So, okay, so what do you see when you have the TFP and the saving ratio? So this is like just a scatter plot. So what I do that I put lag 1 of TFP growth, and so basically I regress saving ratio to lag 1 of TFP growth. The correlation here is 0.15, and it's like it comes significant even at 1% level of significance. If the
फर्स्ट ईयर का अपने पास रिकॉर्ड रखो।
हाँ, क्योंकि कंफ्यूजन ना हो ना
ठीक है
उनका, क्योंकि वापस हो जाएगा अभी।
and sorry, and then I have another regression where I regress TFP growth on lag of saving. So this is like a very like simple way of looking a lead lag correlation, which gives you some idea about the causation or possible causation actually. Here I rule out that there is no way that there is some causation from saving to TFP, because correlation is like required for any meaning of causation actually to some extent. So that's like very simple way of possibly ruling out the direction of causation, but this is like not very kind of, you can say, robust or maybe not very sophisticated. But that also tells you that possibly the direction is from TFP to saving and not from saving to TFP. What happens if I go to lag 2? If I go to lag 2 also, the kind of the relation is as before. And this tells me two things, that not only that the correlation looks significant from TFP to saving, but also tells me that this correlation is also more persistent. What happens here that this correlation turns from positive to negative, slight negative, and is still not significant. When you look at lag 2 of saving and TFP growth, this turns negative and not significant. And if you look at the previous slide, you might not be like kind of able to judge the slope of this line, but the correlation that I estimate here is around 5 times of the correlation that I estimate here. And this is not also significant. So having some prima facie evidence that, okay, fine, there is a possibility of causation running from TFP to saving, I move one step further. What I do that I create a kind of, you can say, artificial experiment in my data, the data that I have. I go and I identify the periods of like kind of increase in savings. So I look for a time window of 3 years, and this detail is explained in the paper. So I'm not going into technicality, but the point is very simple. I look, for like a small window of time when the saving rate has increased in my sample countries. So if you see like in a very small window of time around this 0, like 2 to 3 years, the saving rate increases by like 10% actually in these sample countries. What happens to productivity growth in those countries where they experience a very high rate of saving rate, where they experience a very high increase in saving rate in a very small window? Yes, TFP increases, but the TFP flattens out, like it comes back to normal after 5 to 6 years. So yeah, as somebody was mentioning before, yes, if you look at the data, you may find that this correlation is there, and increase in saving possibly leads to increase in productivity growth. But what this exercise shows you that, yeah, it increases, but it is not sustained. What happens if you look the transition other way around? Here, what I do that I like allow now and find countries which have seen a more than 2% increase in productivity growth in a very like small interval of time. The interval is same as before. So here you see the productivity growth rises by more than 2% in a very small period of time, and it remains at elevated level. What happens to saving? The saving increases, and it remains at elevated level for long actually. So the saving has no tendency to flatten out after the productivity growth has been kind of sustained. So like these two exercises that I just showed you basically like reaffirm my faith that, okay, it seems more likely that the causation is running from a TFP growth to saving rather than other way around.
I have one
Uh,
question.
yeah.
How long are these productivity growth sustained? So you have looked at the rise around a 3-year window or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I mean, once it has suppose reached a high point, as in the figure.
It
So,
is the
uh, like for how long would it stay sustained or something?
it's
I mean,
just it,
or is
it
it
is
more of a
just
fluctuation? That's my
no, no, it
question.
is not a more of it's not like cyclical fluctuation, sir, because it is sustained up to 10 years in the data, like long period. I have looked only till 10 years, so I'm sure about that
Right.
it is sustained at 10 years, which is not a short period of time. So it is like sustained actually. So
And
it's
the
not a
savings
cyclical
rate,
fluctuation.
right? And the savings rate, you said that it kind of lasts. I mean, it keeps on
Yes,
moving upwards, right? I mean, that is of the order of how much you
it
mentioned?
increases by around 4%.
Okay.
I will say 0.2 to point. So it's like 20% of GDP. Here it's like 24% of GDP.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so now coming back to the theory. So I have just shown you something from the data, and I have made a prima facie case that the growth to saving correlation looks more plausible even in the data. But the evidence is still not very conclusive and not very sophisticated, in other words. So I'm going to now talk a bit in detail about what neoclassical growth theory has to say about this productivity growth and saving kind of relationship. And this part of, I think, theoretical aspect has been like almost forgotten actually. I'm not aware of earlier literature which were like centered around this kind of argument, but in recent times, I haven't seen much of the stuff coming around this aspect. So I have a very simple model actually, and this is like a prototype neoclassical growth model, where consumers have utility from consumption and they have basically utility from leisure. And then I have a kind of a budget constraint that these consumer has to like kind of face period by period. I allow for a investment wage for these households, and this investment wage is very similar to the investment wage in chariot all. And this investment wage allows us to capture the imperfection that you can think about investment in an economy, like possibly some government giving incentive for investment, some government trying to keep like interest rate depressed, so that doesn't allow much investment. Lot of factors which we cannot kind of like which we cannot specifically control. All those factors we can think of as a wage that is like between basically investment, basically wage for investment. This is called a wage because this is going to distort the first order condition for the household. So in the first order condition, without this wage, the usual marginal conditions will hold, but this wage will now like create a kind of, you can say, exogenous change in those marginal conditions. And how this wage evolves, this wage is an exogenous process, and not only this allows us to like kind of control for investment related in imperfection, because as argued, we believe that investment is likely to be related to saving and might be driving saving. So we want to kind of take into that account. And as argued by Greenwood, this also basically investment wage also control for investment specific technology shock. So there could be some exogenous changes in investment specific technology. So this wage also controls for that. And this wage also basically controls for any kind of financial frictions that you can think of in the economy. So this wage is like very important in that way, that it like captures like several investment related things in the economy which we cannot control specifically, and each of them. This is like a part of the model. Rest of the model is very simple. These households basically accumulate capital. And then I have a production function, and where this is like the measure of TFP that you have seen in the data. In the model, this TFP basically evolving as an exogenous process, where the persistence is like kind of rho. And then the model has a government. The government spends a certain fraction of total output, but that fraction is basically time varying. And when I estimate this model, I correct the government expenditure for export and import. So it's basically the government expenditure plus net export. So what effectively I do that I assume that government and net exports together like are a certain percentage of the GDP, and that percentage is allowed to vary. And how that percentage varies exogenously actually. So what I do, I estimate this model for 47 countries for which I have at least 40 years of data, and I get this productivity shock. And then I'm going to like kind of map this productivity shock and like try to convince you that this productivity shock that I have here from the model has similar pattern as the TFP that you see in the data. So this is not something kind of fictional or like not very imaginative. This is something like very real. And this is very less likely to be endogenous actually, because this has been calculated after controlling for several other factors which you may argue like is likely to affect like kind of saving rate. So this is like the model that is used. And just to clarify, this is the like productivity shock, which is going to be called like cyclical productivity shock. So this is like cyclical in a sense that it has it doesn't have any trained component, means it doesn't it is like bounded in terms of both mean and variance. So what I do
just one quick question, the productivity shocks, I mean the productivity process, this log 80, and in the previous slide you had that tau IT, right? These two processes are independent of each other?
Yes, they are both. So there are three exogenous processes here. One is this wage, which is exogenous, and they're independent. Yes, and this is like productivity, which is independent. And there is another like exogenous process, which basically changes this government plus net export fraction. That is also like all these three are independent.
And are these standard assumptions? I mean, are they?
Yes, these are standards because the independence allows me to argue that these are structural.
Okay.
Abhishek, there's a question in the chat, which is kind of long. Maybe I'll read it out at the end.
What's the temporal structure on the error terms? I mean, on these processes?
These are like kind of normal with constant variance.
Okay, so like for example, they are not. Are they persistent over time? The correlation.
Yes. This row is going to capture the persistence. So this.
So that's just white noise, basically.
No, they are not. The white noise is this.
Yeah, epsilon.
This has some persistence, and this row would be estimated for each country actually. Each country, sorry.
So just a AR1 structure. Okay.
Yeah, it's a AR1 structure. Yeah, to be specific. Yeah. Okay, so then I move to a slightly involved specification of productivity. And why I moved to this, because this has a very important implication for Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. In nutshell, what permanent income hypothesis tells you that any permanent kind of change in income is like kind of going to be like consumed actually. So you don't save a lot from the permanent change in income, but you save a lot from cyclical change in income. In the language of Stock and Watson, what they say that, okay, when there is a permanent change in income, you expect that your level of income in future would be much more higher than the level today. So you don't need to bother about saving. You consume a lot today. It means you borrow from the future and start consuming. But when there is a cyclical change in income, you are like more concerned and you want to smooth your consumption. So you want to save a lot. So that is like the idea to like disentangle these like permanent and cyclical component. So what I do, I continue with the same production function, but now I say that the productivity is made up of two components, like the permanent and cyclical component. The permanent component is now a unit-root process or a random walk. And the difference of that, log difference of that, basically you can say has a AR1 process. So permanent component in itself is a random walk, but when you take a log difference, that's basically growth. That growth is basically AR1 process. And I continue with a kind of cyclical component as before. So when I have both of these, basically, I have a productivity process which have been disentangled into permanent and cyclical component. Also, this is important because when you have only cyclical component, you are going to assume in terms of, if I have to think about a steady state, you will assume a steady state of these economies having a level of income actually in the steady state. Here, when you have a trained component, you are basically having a steady state which has a kind of a growth in a steady state. So the two steady states are very different. In the first one, you are thinking about a level steady state. In this one, with a trend growth, you are thinking about a growth steady state. So that's also like kind of different in terms of what you are assuming about a steady state of the economy.
I have
Okay,
one
so
question
what is
here.
the
I am
basic
trying
difference?
to. Hello.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, when you decompose this log 80 into the trend and the cyclical part, and you assume that the trend part is following a random walk, the log 80 was itself stationary, right? Given your
no, no, no.
AR1 structure, I mean, the
Oh,
row
that is a
was
different
not
model.
less than one.
That is a different model.
Uh,
So
okay.
I
And
estimate to a model when I assume this to be like cyclical, it's only. Then I
okay, okay.
and then I try
Oh,
I
so
go
now you
one
have a
step further.
trend component. I
Yes,
see.
I'm going to further disentangle that into two. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, so what is the basic difference between trend and cyclical shock? If you think in terms of consumption ILR, which is like the driving force in these two models, the consumption ILR doesn't depend upon the cyclical component. So you have a cyclical shock, your productivity has increased, you will save a lot of that because you want to smooth consumption. But the consumption ILR changes with like trend productivity shock. So how it changes, the derivation is like very standard, I think, and is in the paper, but I'm going to just explain you here. When there is a trend productivity shock, the right-hand side of the ILR basically decreases. And that means you have to decrease the left-hand side of the ILR to remain on the ILR. And that means you want to consume more today. Then only you can decrease your marginal utility of consumption today. So what this trend shock basically does is that it forces you to consume more today, and that means you will decrease your saving. And the idea is very simple, that what these two shocks have for saving is completely opposite. The cyclical shock says that you will increase saving, and the trend shock say, oh, you will decrease saving. I'm going to go even one step like after that and try to like make some point about these observations that I have here about the broad implication of trend and cyclical shock. I'm going to bring one more ingredient actually in the model, and which is again the gradualism. I started with a very simple model, and then I'm trying to augment that with certain feature which has become standard in the literature now. So I'm going to also say, okay, assume that these guys have habit persistence in the consumption. Because this was like noted by Carol earlier that, okay, fine, if you say that trend shock decreases saving, then why it hasn't decreased saving in China? They have been growing a lot. At the same time, their saving has increased a lot. So that observation about China was completely like against the neoclassical growth theory that I showed you here. it says that the trend shock should decrease saving, but the saving and growth, basically trend shock, were like both like in the positive direction in China for some time in India as well. And then the argument that Carroll and others brought is that, okay, fine, it's not only the simple utility that you have assumed. You have to think about habit in consumption to reconcile these issues. So what a habit in consumption does, that you do not derive utility from your current consumption, but you basically derive utility from your current consumption and a certain parameter multiplied consumption last time or last period. So difference of this. How this parameter affects your utility specification, this parameter is called habit persistence. And higher habit persistence means that you derive or you put more and more weight on growth in consumption, that level of consumption. So suppose this becomes 1, if this becomes 1, that means you are not deriving any utility from level of consumption. You derive utility from growth in consumption only. So no matter what is your level, you are not deriving any utility because you don't care about level. You only care about growth of consumption. And this allows you to like kind of reconcile certain anomalies that I mentioned about the implication of a neoclassical growth model for savings. Okay, so what the model says. So the model now has a very clear cut implication for cyclical shock. So these are, pardon me if you can't see, these are about like the persistence actually. The red line is a high persistence shock and the blue line is a less persistent shock. Irrespective of the persistence, irrespective of the persistence, basically the cyclical shock has a very kind of clear implication. It says increased saving at impact, or at least for 3-4 periods. The slight dip that you see here is because of the calibration and non-linearity in the model, but the important point is that the like kind of the implication is very straightforward in terms of impact effect. But the trend shock has very different implications. That at a very high level of persistence of trend shock, you are more sure about your income being higher in the future. So you definitely reduce your saving today. But if the trend shock is very less persistence, as in the black line, then you may end up increasing your saving despite your trend shock. So now this poses another layer of challenge for empirical identification, because not only that the distinction between trend and cycle is important to understand saving, but also the persistence of these shocks are going to play important role. And as you have, like as I explained earlier, I'm going to deal with 47 economies. So obviously these economies have very different levels of persistence of trend shock as well as cyclical shock. So I have to be a bit careful about the fact that these countries may be heterogeneous, and the model has like different implications for a different level of persistence. How it is played with habit. So again, if you look at habit, what happens that higher habit basically increases saving due to cyclical shock. If I have more habit persistence, then even with cyclical shock, I save more than I would have saved with less habit. And in case of trend shock, this basically decreases the negative effect of productivity. So trend shock, low habit, you decrease your consumption, decrease your saving by a lot. But if you have higher habit, you will decrease your saving by less. There is a possibility that if I do a reasonable enough calibration, then with some different level of habit, you may even increase your saving due to trend shock, as argued by Carroll. My point here is very limited, that in a sense to suggest you or show you that when I disentangle these shocks and show you different implications, I have to be also careful about these cross-country heterogeneity, because the effect of the shock is going to depend on two crucial parameters, that is the persistence of the shock and habit persistence in consumption across countries. So I have to somehow keep that in mind when I do the like kind of empirical test from the model. in a sense, empirical test from the model about effect of productivity growth on saving. Is there any question so far? Because I'm about to finish this first half and move to second half. So if anybody has any question, I would be happy to take that. Else I will move. No, so I will continue. Okay, so what is my empirical specification? My empirical specification is very simple. That I'm going to have a like kind of regression which will have savings, and then I'm going to regress that on like per capita income, and then bunch of control which has been used in literature. As I showed you that there is a heterogeneity in saving based on income, I'm also going to control for a non-linearity possibly in saving income relationship. And finally, I'm going to bring this TFP in an extended model. I'm going to only present to you what happens to this TFP, because that is like kind of my focus. And other like parameters have been presented in the paper, but I'm not going to kind of discuss them. But I control for almost everything which has been used in the literature. And the focus would be to like convince you that I have a causal estimate of this beta 0. So what happens when you do a local projection? So what I do that I take the same specification and then I take TFP in the data and then I do a local projection regression for saving. As I showed you in the earlier correlation in the data, it seems that the effect of TFP on saving is more persistent, because the correlation didn't buzz when I moved from lag 1 to lag 2. It remained almost same. And that comes from the local projection regression when I almost control for everything that has been used in the literature, and also the lag of saving. So an increase in productivity growth increases the saving ratio up to 5 years actually, and this effect is significant. So this is like still from the data, and you can like kind of question that, okay, it may have omitted variable bias, or it may be kind of again some simultaneity. I have the lag saving, but yeah, some argument can be still made. But the regression also shows what was basically coming in the data without controlling for anything. So even if I control for almost everything, I do have the same pattern that I showed you in the data. And that gives me further confidence that, okay, it seems to me that this is a possible direction of causation. So what I do, I'm going to like do a model validation. In a sense, how do I validate my model? So I have a model. Now the next part that I'm going to do is to use the socks that I have from the model as an instrument for the TFP in the data. Because those are most likely instrument because they satisfy both kind of relevance and exclusion criteria. And so it's like an artificial instrument that I have created, but that's likely to work. So the instrument shows like a very similar the socks that I have from the model shows very similar pattern that I showed you of the sock in the that I showed you like of the pattern of TFP in the data. I showed you that TFP is more volatile in non-high income countries in comparison to high income countries. And when I estimate the model, doesn't matter whether I take the trained sock or cyclical sock. These socks basically have the similar pattern, not exact, but similar pattern as the TFP in the data. Again, I find that both cyclical sock and trained sock have more variance or higher standard deviation in non-high income countries. So this allows me to like kind of in a sense make to argue that the model is like kind of relevant, and the SOC that I have extracted from the model is reasonable enough, and therefore can be used for like the work that I'm planning to do. This is just an offshoot which is not very much related to the work that I'm doing, but this is like important point because I'm making the distinction between cyclical and trained productivity SOC. So this trained productivity SOC has been argued to be one of the major reason for problems in developing economies actually. So think about this. The idea is very simple. That okay, you expect your you experience a trained productivity growth, so you basically decrease your saving today, but this trained productivity doesn't persist, so you have a like kind of a business cycle which is like a lot more volatile. And this was the idea of a paper of a very celebrated paper by Agwar and Gopinath. But they used a very simple kind of setup in a sense. They didn't allow for the habit persistence. So what happens when you look at the dominance of cycle and trend in non-high income high income country? When you do not have habit persistence, then you find that yes, as argued by Agwar and Gopinath, the non-high income countries are dominated by basically trend component. How this dominance has been calculated? So I have both these trend and cyclical component in all these countries. I calculate the standard deviation of these two components and find the ratio of that. If the ratio is greater than 1 trend upon cycle, then I call that this particular country is trend dominated. So almost twice like the countries in non-high income group are basically dominated by trends, 6 versus 12. Here you have basically
स्टूडेंट वाला क्या है स्टूडेंट वाला स्टूडेंट को मिलेगा उसमें कोई चलो
okay sorry
बस
Yeah, Abhishek, just carry on.
okay, so but what happens if you kind of if you allow for habit persistence to come in? If you allow the habit persistence to come in, then you do not find that the emerging economies or non-high income countries are like kind of dominated by trend. Only 2 countries out of 18 countries you find are dominated by trend, but you do not control for habit. You find a large number of non-high income countries are dominated by trend in terms of proportion, I mean to say. So the point is that the trend and cyclical dominance crucially depends upon the assumption about habit in consumption, and this has not been kind of I think taken well into the earlier literature. Okay, so finally, this is like the main table that I have. So what I do, I first use TFP from the data, and I did a regression, and I estimated a coefficient of 0.118. This coefficient is significant at 1% level of significance. Then I estimate the model for 47 economies, and then I calculate several measures of productivity SOC from these economies. Cyclical component only trend component, then cyclical and trend both, and then cyclical and trend with habit persistence. And what I'm going to do now, that I'm going to use these SOCs as an instrument for my TFP in the data, because these SOCs are like kind of like reasonable and like reasonable instrument for the problem that I have in mind. What I find that the SOCs are very strong instrument, as I expect, because the minimum Craig Donald first stage FI that I get is like 573. You can say that it's like very unreasonable, very high value, but yeah, we have, because we have almost same thing in the model and the data. So this comes like with a very good amount of correlation. But one thing like remains that the trend component doesn't seems to affect, doesn't seem to work actually, even if I use an instrument. So this is like this is the cyclical component of the shock. When I estimate the cyclical component using linearly retrended data, I get a coefficient of around 0.2. This is the cyclical component that I obtain using HP filter data. I get around 0.11. This is the shock that I have from trained only model that I get around 0.129. Then I have a model with both trained and cyclical. When I use trained, I get a coefficient which is very close to what I've been getting earlier, but this doesn't turn significant. Then I use the cyclical component from that model where we have both trained and cyclical. And the idea that we had in the beginning that this may help us in overcoming the endogeneity seems to be like to a large extent successful to me. It has given us estimate which is not likely to suffer from endogeneity. And these are a very strong instrument actually. Okay, so what happens about TFP saving and Friedman's permanent income hypothesis? So when you kind of control for everything and then you bring the permanent shock and a cyclical shock. So what happens? You still see that cyclical shock increases saving and the effect persists for at least 2 years. This is from the model. So these are not likely to suffer from endogeneity. These are shocks coming from the model. And by definition, they are structural in nature. And these cyclical shock affect saving ratio. But if you look at the trend shock, they don't affect the saving ratio actually. They don't increase your saving at all. Ideally, you would have expected that this would decrease your saving, but they do not decrease possibly in our case because of some cross-country heterogeneity that we are not able to control for. Or because of the fact that this differences in row and habit persistence is not allowing us to kind of capture that decline. Or maybe the row is like a very low in some country, very high in some country, and therefore the effect cancels out. We do not know why that happens, but this is like something that is that can be argued based on the theory that I have presented. Because if few countries have very high row, they will decrease saving. Few countries have very low row, they will increase saving. And then you will see on an average that trend shock doesn't affect saving. But the theory is unambiguous about cyclical shock, that it should increase saving. And that unambiguity is basically captured in here actually when you regress the saving rate on cyclical shock. So in our like view, this is a direct test for Friedman's permanent income hypothesis using cross-country data. And it passes like kind of the smell test in a sense that, okay, it works. The permanent income hypothesis works actually.
I have two questions. Sorry to interrupt. First is that the results on the previous slide were based on pooled regression, right?
No. These all have like country fixed effects and everything that you have seen here. Everything here.
Okay. Right, sir.
Based on even the country fixed effect. I have only presented you the coefficient of this and the coefficient this, not this, but this one. I will say this one. I have presented results of this regression, which is number 3. I have presented the coefficient of this from the data when I use actual TFP, and then when I have instrumented this TFP from the shocks using the model. So only I have presented you this beta 0 under different scenarios. But the specification is this.
Right, but had it been a country-wise, and it was based on empirical data, we would have different beta naught coefficients for the countries, right? But
no,
because this shock is generated from the model using the instrument.
Yes.
That is why we have one set of observations instead of 47.
Yes, though, but the model is but the model is estimated one at a time for each country. And that's the idea of like doing the local projection. You have a shock. Now I have a shock. I can regress this shock on whatever I want. because that's like by definition like exogenous. That's the basic idea of doing these local projection on panel data, that you take out the SOC country specific and then you do a panel, because that allows you to like estimate a better average effect.
Right.
Basically, at the end of the day, you are interested in an average effect. So when I pull in a sense, not pull regression, pull data and control for country fixed effect, I mean to say, that allows you to have a better average effect, which you may not get doing a kind of a country by regression. Like that's not our objective, to specifically explore saving in a particular country.
Okay, right.
No,
And
am I clear? Yeah.
yes, sir. And also in the last slide that you were saying, in which you were comparing trend and cyclical shocks,
Yeah.
are these results dependent on the standard error of these shocks? As in, it might be the case because they are two different, as in these shocks, trend and cyclical shocks pull the savings rate in opposite directions. But is it because that the
okay.
standard error of the cyclical shocks are more?
Yeah, I would like to clarify. This is a slightly sticky point. I should say that the basic neoclassical theory suggests you that these two shocks should pull savings in opposite direction. But the moment you start thinking about the persistence of these shocks and habit persistence in consumption, then the behavior of the trend stock is more tricky actually, because I explained like earlier, it also depends upon the persistence of the shock. It also depends upon the habit persistence in consumption. So then, but those bringing those things doesn't changes the implication of cyclical shocks. So the point is simple, that the implication of cyclical shock for saving is very unambiguous actually. It has to increase saving. But what a trend shock does, okay, it should decrease saving, but it may not decrease saving if the trend shock is very low persistence or there is a very high habit persistence. The point that I'm trying to make is that cross-country heterogeneity becomes very, very important for estimation of the effect of trend shock on productivity. And the argument is simple, that it could be the reason that there are countries with a different level of habit persistence or different level of like persistence of the shock, trend shock itself, that nullifies each other. And we explain in our paper that we have a very large distribution of habit persistence that is estimated, as well as the like persistence of the shock. So basically, we are exploiting the unambiguity and like ambiguity. Here, there is ambiguity. So we are saying, okay, fine, this might be canceling each other, which is likely to cancel based on the wide distribution of habit persistence that we estimate, as well as the wide range of persistence of trend shock that we estimate. So they might be canceling each other, and that's why we don't see any effect of trend shock on productivity. But here the effect is like unambiguous, and we get that. No, it doesn't make sense.
Right, so thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so that's like about that. And then like I have a final slide, which is like something that I have already like told you several times during this, that there is evidence of productivity growth causing saving and not the other way around. And permanent income hypothesis is supported by data. It turns out that it works really well across a wide range of countries. And countries should focus on promoting policies to boost productivity growth and thereby achieve higher savings instead of focusing on savings induced policies alone. Because a lot of countries put a lot of effort in trying to kind of do some big bang things to directly influence saving. In our view, that's not likely to work. Even if it works in short run, it's not likely to lead to sustained increase in saving. And why this thing that we have to say is more relevant now, because it is now the case that saving like productivity is no more a black box. So 20 years ago, productivity was more like a black box. We have not much understanding about what determines the productivity, what determines productivity growth. But now with a lot of literature coming on, starting from Klenov and other people, Rodriguez, we have a much better and nuanced understanding about productivity growth. So when I make this policy implication, I'm not directing towards something basically black box. I have something like kind of a reasonable things to point to where you can work to improve saving. Thank you.
All right. So there's a question in the chat, somewhat detailed. In fact, there are a number of questions. Do you want to take them one by one, or should you? What do I?
No, I can take them one by one. I'm fine.
All right. So they say that, in the neoclassical or even classical model, the transmission mechanism goes from savings to capital formation to investment to growth.
Mm-hmm.
The model that is shown implicitly implies the typical mechanism where savings lead to investment and capital goods and R&D for inducing productivity growth. So it is not just productivity growth unilaterally determining saving.
Okay, so my answer to that would be very simple, that in neoclassical model, there is like kind of almost no way to exogenously change saving rate, but you have an ample scope in neoclassical model to allow exogenous variation in productivity. So I'm exploiting that. That what neoclassical model has to say about exogenous variation in productivity and its effect on saving rate. The argument other way around, that okay, it's saving rate that influences productivity, is not that well I think established in neoclassical literature, because most of these neoclassical models have focused on technological shock and not on the saving shock. So I think that is like almost well established in the literature, that exogenous variation in productivity is allowed, but we do not know how to allow for exogenous variation in saving rate.
Right.
That's my understanding of the neoclassical model. Yeah.
Okay. So the second question is, where is the investment wedge coming from? Is it due to productivity-led differences?
The investment, the households basically make investment. The household is very simple. They have to make a choice based on the productivity that they experience, the investment ways that they experience, and the government expenditure that they experience. So based on these three exogenous variations, they have to decide how much they want to save. Whatever they decide to save is automatically invested actually in that economy. So there is no, I will say, there is no way that household saving decision is a kind of not dependent on productivity. Obviously, their saving decision is dependent upon the productivity that they face. Because this is what these three exogenous forces they take into account before making their like kind of decision, or their lifetime decision depends upon these three forces actually.
Okay. Right. And finally, so how does the idea of the paper relate to optimal saving model of the Ramsey type for determining growth endogenously? Do you incorporate the role of habit formation in a behavioral model with micro foundations of input
No,
and plural consumption?
no, these habit formations are completely external actually in that way. Yeah.
Okay, all right. And the other question, which is, how does the idea of the paper relate to the optimal saving model for determining growth endogenously?
No, we do not talk about optimal savings. So frankly, I have nothing to like comment on that.
Okay. Okay, so we have some time. We have about 5 minutes or so in case there are other questions, and wait a minute. just to see if there is any question. But thanks, Abhishek. That was a very interesting talk. Let's just wait to see if there are more questions, and if not, we can end it.
So Abhishek, can you just show us the government's the path that government follows? Like, how do you close the model? I missed that part.
Okay, so government is like very simple. Government spends a certain fraction of output every period. Like this is like the government expenditure that you have. This is output, and then you have this GT, which gives you 1 minus 1 upon GT. This gives you the share of the government. So and this we basically we allow this share to exogenously varying. There is a steady state government consumption, which I calibrate using data from all these countries. So there's a lot of back end work goes into, which I haven't kind of explained, because all these parameters are country specific, and all these parameters are calibrated using those country specific data. So there is a steady state.
So you have calibrated assuming the balance budget holds in every period. It looks like that you have assumed in every period. But typically, then have you missed the bond and those have been issued by the government?
Not basically because of the Ricardian equivalence operating here. It doesn't matter a lot for us actually.
No, but you are focusing on the saving rate, right? If I can remember correctly, the rates are not going to be different, and if you delay your payments and all these things, because the government expenditure will also be affected, right?
Yes, yes.
Can that affect the rate? The saving rate?
Yeah, so okay. I think okay, I understand your point that but that something is not very much required for us, as long as we are interested in productivity shock actually. The point is that
but the thing is that suppose you have a productivity shock and government can borrow something from outside and just mitigate the shock, but that shock will be realized in the future actually, because the government is just deferring this shock.
I understand that point. Okay, so my answer to that would be that as long as I'm having these kind of in a sense complete market assumption, like these kind of Ricardian households, playing around here is not going to change much about the discussion that I'm having right now. So to think about those things, I need to go back to the household and have to change their structure and make it more complicated. Yeah.
Okay. And what was the assumption on your utility functions and households, like for how many years?
No, this is like these are households like maximize their lifetime utility.
Okay.
So like kind of the question that you are posing can be addressed, but then those requires like slightly more restrictive assumptions on household. Like we need to go into incomplete market and I have to make these households somehow non-Ricardian. Then that makes more sense. But otherwise, these households don't bother whether the government finances by debt or by kind of tax. They don't bother actually, because that's basically the simple idea of Ricardian equivalence. So what matters for them is government expenditure. What doesn't matter for them is how government finances those expenditure. That doesn't matter for them. So I just control for the movement in government expenditure. I don't care about how the government is funding those expenditure, because of the Ricardian equivalence assumed for these households. The government scheme of funding these expenditures is not relevant for me.
But in a lifetime, in a lifetime model, that will affect, right?
No, it doesn't matter how the government funds it. How much government spends, that matters. But how government funds doesn't matter actually.
Why do you say so?
Because if suppose government is spending more but not taxing you today, and borrowing, then you know that government will pay, like have to repay this borrowing like in future, then government will tax you. Then you basically like save today because you are a permanent income household. You are optimizing your lifetime utilities, so you take into account.
But don't you think that that will be too smooth? Like if you
that is a problem these models have. I agree with that. That leads to excess smoothing.
Yeah, and that's why you have brought this habit thing, right?
To slightly resolve that, but not completely. The excessive smoothing still persists.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Nice talk.
Thank you.
Abhishek. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Any further questions? We still have a little time. Doesn't look like we have any. All right, Abhishek, thanks a lot. Thanks
Thank you.
Thanks for the participants as well, making it quite an interesting talk.